Last week on Rosh Hashanah, I gave a sermon about making good choices. That Judaism itself, that we're all Jews by choice, and Judaism itself is a great life choice for us. And that it's mostly because Judaism gives us a foundation to make 4 really important choices. The first is to choose to see our own potential in the world. And the second is to choose to give ourselves a higher purpose to work towards. The third is to choose to join with other people in a community. And the fourth was to choose to take a responsibility for the world. Those are those 4 choices I spoke about last week. Now, a few days after Rosh Hashanah was over, I had coffee with a friend of mine who's a Christian pastor. We do this every year. And we sit down, and I'm talking to him about my talk and how well it went. And I thought, I'd give a really interesting talk. And he says, "That's a great message," he said to me, "except you left out how hard it is to make those choices. You left out the obstacles. And it's not just," he says, "it's not like I can just turn on a light switch and click, now I'm living the most awesome life possible." And I said, "Go on." Okay. And he began to explain to me that he thinks that, we have to really address some of the obstacles to making good choices. And so I'm going to do that today. I want to begin with a story from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. It's one of his most famous stories. Once there was a king who lived in a great castle, and he had a beautiful daughter that he loved greatly. And their lives were wonderful, and as they moved to the same rhythms, they were in love with each other, as fathers and daughters tend to be. But as she got older, she became less interested in being with her dad than being with her friends. And the king saw this and became both sad and angry. Sad because he missed the times they had together, and angry because he thought the princess was being disrespectful of his authority as a father and as a king. And for a while, they actually stopped talking to each other. And when they saw each other, it would always end up in the same fight. "Leave me alone," she would say. "Why don't you listen to me?" he would say. And once, not long after, she came to him and spoke about a boy that she fell in love with, and they want to get married. But since the king had never met this boy before, had never known who he was or what family he came from, he became really angry. And in his anger, the king used his power and his authority to banish the princess to an island at the edge of a kingdom in a walled castle. And it wasn't much later did the king realized what he had done. And so, with all his effort and with all his might, he built a boat and crossed the sea. And with all his effort and with all his might, he climbed the wall and crawled back into the palace. And after much talk and much time together, the king and the daughter, they reconciled. And within a year, the princess had married to the boy that she had loved, and the father, the king, turned the keys of the castle over to her to run the kingdom. Now, the rabbi teaches that for whatever reason, life moves us in a way that can shake up our rhythms. And sometimes we're in sync with others, and sometimes we're out of sync. And when we're out of sync, we separate ourselves from our best and truest lives with these great obstacles, with the oceans and the walls that keep us from each other. And we can try to live a life of meaning, but we have to choose it. We have to work at it. And that means overcoming those great obstacles. It wasn't until the king built the boat and scaled the wall that he actually reconciled with his daughter. And the same is true for each of us. Each of us at any time in our lives can be the king or queen. And each of us at any time in our lives can be the princess. And what keeps us fractured and broken and disengaged as human beings are these great walls and oceans that we find between us. And so what are these impediments to connection? What are these obstacles to a blessed life? And on our journey to living a blessed life, we have to cross over those walls and oceans and to keep us from being the person we're meant to be. And so this afternoon, I'm going to speak about those 2 great obstacles. The first is our sense of vulnerability and how we put up walls to shield us from other people when we feel vulnerable. And the second is the great ocean of ubiquitous shame that we carry, that floats in every part of our society. And finally, this afternoon, I'll speak about atonement, a very Yom Kippur word, which of us in our lives don't really understand, but which helps us to scale those walls and cross those oceans and unlocks the door to the castle of the great life that awaits us. You see, we live in a culture that seems to be allergic to vulnerability. It's because we think being vulnerable means being weak, or we think that being vulnerable is just not something we're into, or we think that being vulnerable means that everyone is just up in our business, as if each one of us is a tabloid celebrity. But understanding what vulnerability actually is and how we can overcome the walls that overprotect us, we have to define it apart from weakness or sharing too much of our own personal space. And this is what the renowned therapist Dr. Brené Brown means when she talks about vulnerability. She believes that vulnerability is taking a risk and living with a little uncertainty in life and being available emotionally with people with whom we've got relationships. Yet because of our fear of vulnerability and our fear of being weak and our fear of not being perfect, our fear of taking emotional risks, we put up this protective shield that keeps others out. We build the wall around the castle, or to use a more modern metaphor, each one of us designs with care our own iron dome that shoots down incoming salvos of reality that intrude into our own sense of impenetrability. A good friend comes and might say to you, "How are you?" And your onboard computer might say, "Incoming, red alert, don't tell about how the kids are misbehaving." And you lock onto that and you say, "Fire." Boom. I'm fine. Or your spouse might say, "How was work, honey? Did you get that promotion?" Warning, don't show her failures. It's going fine. Or, "How are we going to pay for camp for the kids? Why haven't you been going to the gym lately? Why can't dinner be on the table when I get home? Why haven't you returned my phone call?" We use our personal iron domes to protect ourselves by shutting down, getting angry, and shutting out the people we love most. How many of us feel the need to put our shields and armor on in order not to appear weak to colleagues or loved ones? How many of us need to hide behind the mask of a smile even though our hearts are breaking? How many of us feel that it's better to keep people out of our lives because letting them in is just too hard? The truth is that when we make ourselves impenetrable, we keep everything out, the bad stuff and the good stuff. We miss out on the best parts of life because we're too afraid of the worst parts. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud were never afraid of being vulnerable. Only 4 pages into the Talmud, 4 out of thousands of pages, the topic of vulnerability is brought up. It's in a story. A great teacher named Rabbi Yochanan, he became really sick. And he holds himself up in his chambers away from everyone else and refuses for anyone to see him. And eventually his student, his friend, Rabbi Hanina, came and visited him. And Rabbi Hanina said to Rabbi Jonathan, "Are your sufferings endearing to you? Are they something you wear as a badge of honor? Are you such a private person that you wouldn't receive help when it's offered?" To which Rabbi Jonathan said, "Neither my sufferings nor their reward are endearing to me." Rabbi Jonathan finally reached out his hand from his sickbed to be lifted up. And as he became stronger with the help of his students, he finally said, "You know, one cannot break out of prison on his own." The rabbis knew that from the get-go we put up these walls to keep out others of our deepest selves, including the walls that keep ourselves out of our own hearts. But these walls can go from being a bulwark to being a prison. Instead of keeping others out, we keep ourselves locked in. And it's only through openness to the uncertainty and to risk, it's through the willingness to be vulnerable and let others in, can we break out of our own prisons. and find that journey to a blessed life. Overcoming the wall of vulnerability, I know, is hard to do. But to have the greatest and most blessed life, we have to risk our own vulnerability. In fact, when we take the risk, when we share with each other, Dr. Brown, who I mentioned just a minute ago, through her amazing decades of research, has demonstrated that vulnerability itself leads to greater happiness, a sense of worthiness in life, and greater innovation and productivity in the workplace. When leaders show that they are vulnerable, their followers feel closer to them. When managers show that they're vulnerable, their employees work harder. Vulnerability is the key to inspiration, not the thing that keeps it out. The second great obstacle, besides that wall around the castle, is the ocean. And it's the ocean of shame that's everywhere. I want to take a moment to talk about a young boy whose name was Carlos Vigil. Carlos was a 17-year-old teenager in New Mexico who committed suicide. When he was 8 years old, he had a smiley-faced lunchbox that he had absolutely loved. Bullies on the school bus took his lunchbox and broke it, and they called him gay. And over the course of next several years, Carlos would periodically come home with bruises and scratches. His parents worried about him, and he tried to get him help, but he shrugged it off. But by high school, Carlos finally revealed to his parents how much he was bullied. He also indeed disclosed to them that he is gay. And his parents embraced him, and they loved him, and they worked hard to help him. They even transferred him to a new school across town. And in his new environment, Carlos seemed to thrive. He came out of his shell. He joined clubs. He even spoke out against bullying and became an advocate and helped others who wanted to come out of the closet just like he did. Yet after the move, the support of his family, Carlos, his inner pain was just too much. And on July 13th of last year, this is what he posted to Twitter. He said, "I'm sorry to those whom I have offended over the years. I'm blind to see that I, as a human being, suck. I'm an individual who is doing an injustice to the world, and it's time for me to leave. Please don't ever feel sorry for me or cry, because I had an opportunity at life, and that opportunity is over. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to love someone or have someone love me. I guess it's best, though, because now I leave no pain onto anyone. The kids in school are right. I'm a loser, I'm a freak, and I'm a fag. And in no way it's acceptable for people to deal with. I'm sorry for not being the person that would make someone proud. I'm free now. Love, Carlos." And about 10 minutes later, Carlos took his own life because he was ashamed of being gay. This is what shame can do. It can literally kill us. And so we need to name this, our shame. Shame is the feeling of disconnection between ourselves and other people. It's a sense of being unworthy in the world. It's saying, I'm not worthy of your love. I'm not worthy of your friendship. I'm not worthy of your attention. It's very, very different than guilt. And as Jews, we know guilt. You could even say we created guilt. Guilt is summarized by saying, I did something bad. I messed up. Or more likely, like from my mother, you messed up. You did something bad. You don't call enough. You don't bring the kids over enough. I don't see you enough. But shame is different. It means being ridiculed or rejected at the deepest level. And it's everywhere in our lives. The prophet Jeremiah describes shame as an image of peers who turned their back in shame against the people of Israel. It's a feeling of deep humiliation and lost connection from other people. It's a feeling of being lost. It's a feeling of exile. And as Jews, we know that feeling too. Shame is not guilt. Guilt is saying, I did something bad or I messed up. Shame is saying, I am bad or I am messed up. Or as Carlos said, I'm a freak. I'm not a person that would make anyone proud. That's shame. And that's the ocean that blocks us from our own personal greatness. Shame is everywhere, and that's why it's an ocean. Because at one time or another, we all have felt ashamed. And it's perhaps the greatest obstacle that keeps us from having a blessed life. You don't have to be Carlos to feel shame. Shame is having a father who won't notice you even when you make partner. Shame is never feeling thin enough. Shame is feeling that you can't get it all done. Shame is feeling that you will never live up to your parents' expectation. Shame is feeling that you will never have enough money to give your family what they want. Shame is feeling that you need to work instead of being a stay-at-home mom. Shame is feeling that you're failing to show your children the way and that you're falling into gender stereotypes by being a stay-at-home mom. And for some, shame is feeling that your professor hates you because she is critical of your work. Or shame is feeling that you're not Jewish enough for your parents. Shame is feeling that you're too Jewish for your parents. Shame is having grandparents who don't speak English, and you have to call the power company or the cable company or order in a restaurant for them. And for some, shame is feeling embarrassed by ancestors who never fought back against the Nazis. And for others, shame is feeling embarrassed by relatives who used to treat Arabs the same way that whites used to treat blacks. And for still others, shame is having relatives who you felt abandoned the dream of Israel that you and your ancestors have worked so hard to build. Shame in our community, in the global community, is everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And we all experience it. It is the number one thing that keeps us from getting where we want to be and owning our joy. Shame is such a corrosive force on our personhood and society because it makes us keep secrets we don't need to. It makes us put up that iron dome to keep others out. And it makes us disengage from our better selves, from our family, and from our community. According to studies, those who feel real shame highly correlate with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders. And in case you haven't looked around, we are the most depressed, medicated, suicidal, and obese cohort of adults in human history. And these are the two greatest obstacles to living a great life. The walls we put up because we're afraid to be vulnerable, and our very deep and wide ocean of ubiquitous shame. So far, this has been a pretty dark sermon. Let's see. Vulnerability, shame, and suicide. Way to go, Rabbi. It's Shabbos. It's Yom Kippur. Way to go. But I'm going to give you a Hollywood ending. So how do we overcome these obstacles? Where do we climb out of this dark spiral and back into life? The answer is right in the Torah, where all of our answers are always found. It's why we're here today on Yom Kippur. It's the possibility of a different life, one that allows us to be vulnerable, to deal and name our shame, and makes the best of our days on this earth. It is this holiday, it is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement itself. Atonement in Hebrew is kapara, and it means covering over, like a blanket or a protective covering. Atonement is not an eraser. It's not a sponge. We can't eliminate the past or scrub it clean, but we can become good again, and we can live purely, even for a little while. The Day of Atonement takes shame and vulnerability head on through 3 acts: confession, forgiveness, and indeed joy. You see, in ancient times, on this holy day, as I said earlier, the high priest enters the sacred realm of the Holy of Holies. It's the center of the temple. And as part of his practice, he would place his hands on a goat and confess his sins and the sins of his family and the sins of Israel. This is confession. To confess our deeper selves to each other is to see that you and I are in this together. This is the power of the vidui that we say. For we know that we can't break out of the prisons of our own minds on our own. I remember when my grandfather was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And we were in Texas, and my girlfriend at the time was in California. And I called her, and we sat on the phone, and she kept asking me what was wrong. And it took me literally 10 minutes to say that Zeta was sick. Because once I said it, it became real. And I didn't want to make it real. You see, when we confess life, when we confess ourselves, it makes us vulnerable. It's a risk. But it also names our shame. And any therapist will tell you that in order to excise the demons, you must first cast light on them. And that's why on Yom Kippur, we make our sins real by confessing them. We address them with a beating heart and an open eye. And on Yom Kippur, we confess our sins. We lay bare our shame and our vulnerability through vidui. And we beat our shame out of our lives. Like the high priest, we too can climb out of the darkness with confession. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. We are guilty. We are betrayers. We are robbers. Bashatnu. We are ashamed. The second step that the high priest would take after confession is he would actually go into the sacred chamber, the Holy of Holies, and bow low and say the name of God and ask for forgiveness. Now think about that for just a moment. Here is a man of flesh and blood entering into God's house, into God's bedroom, more or less, and demanding that the creator of the universe forgive the world its transgressions. That's pretty audacious, if you ask me, but it's pretty courageous too. Like the high priest, we too can address our shame with courage. We can make atonement by asserting with the same courage and audacity that we forgive ourselves for all the things we didn't live up to this last year. That we can say that we're not perfect, but we can still be good. We have the courage not to be our addictions. We have the courage not to be our mistakes. We have the courage not to be our failings. We have the courage, the audacity, like the high priest, in each one of us that can address the universe and dare to say, I am still sacred, I am still good, and I deserve better because I am better. There is no shame when you make a mistake. There is only shame in feeling that you are a mistake. Atonement tells us that we can be good again, and we can be clean, and we can walk into the Holy of Holies of our own hearts and come out again re-enlivened to living with the potential for a blessed life. And the last part of Yom Kippur is finding our absolute joy in each other. When the sun begins to set and the formal prayers are ending and the great shofar is about to be sounded, the mood on Yom Kippur turns from somber to joyous. It is said that long ago the youth of Israel would gather and dance and sing, and the parents would watch their children dance wearing white, and they would walk over to each other and begin to make secret wedding arrangements. It is a great ingathering of the community, and it's a great ingathering for love. It is said by the Hasidic rabbis that Yom Kippur, there's another name for it, Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim, a day not of somber, but a day of joy and love. Because nothing feels better than tossing the emotional ball up in the air and seeing it be caught wholeheartedly by someone you care for. When you say, I love you, for the first time, and she says, I love you back. When you say, marry me, and he says, yes. When you say, I'm pregnant, and he says, really? And after a moment, picks you up off the ground and gives you a hug. And when you say, I failed my exam, and your parents say, it's okay. Or you say, I lost my job, or I want to quit, and she says, we'll work it out. Or when you say it's terminal, and your kids wrap their arms around you. Taking the risk to make amends, to be vulnerable, owning your joy, that's real atonement. And we can kill our shame before it kills us. That's the secret of Yom Kippur, and the secret of atonement. We can be good again. We can live purely, even if it's not perfect, because we all make mistakes. The idea of atonement on this holiday of reflection, on this Yom Kippur, is a statement to the world that says we can live with vulnerability, we can live by getting rid of our shame, because with Yom Kippur, with atonement, our future can dictate our past instead of the other way around. That is how the king meets his daughter and turns over the kingdom to her. And that's how he climbed the wall and crossed the ocean out of that dark spiral. Choosing a blessed life, it's not easy. We all have walls to climb and oceans to cross. But on this day, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we can confess, we can forgive, and we can be open to the joy that waits us at every moment. For those obstacles that keep us from choosing the greatest of lives are overcome when we see that we are actually connected to each other. Our joy connected as one. Our love connected as one. One heart, one love, under a God who is one. May you all be sealed in the book of life for goodness, for health, and for peace. And together we say, Amen.